How's it going, everybody? Today I'm here to do something that I don't usually like to do, but in the case of this franchise, I thought, no, I gotta do this. This is the only way, and it might not be entirely an original ranking. This is something that I feel the need to do ever since I saw Dial of Destiny. Based on some of the lukewarm responses towards Dial of Destiny, I realized that this is probably not gonna sit well with some of you. Also, to be clear, I'm not going to include the TV show with Sean Patrick Flannery. I've never actually watched that show, so I can't say whether or not it's good. I've heard some good things about it, but I've never really took the time to give it a try. This is my own personal ranking. Take from this what you will, and try not to crucify me. With Indiana Jones, it's very similar to Star Wars and Marvel as of late. The discussion or discourse has been very heated, although not nearly as much as those other two that I mentioned. With Dial of Destiny, considering the studio behind it, I am still disheartened by the negative backlash, but I also am not surprised. All that out of the way, let's get into my ranking of the Indiana Jones franchise. Starting at the bottom, I don't really think it's that big of a surprise. It's Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. It's no secret that this movie has been severely hated for several years. From the nuking the fridge, to the monkey swinging with Shia LaBeouf in the one action sequence towards the finale, and a bunch of other things, how the movie looks really cheap and clean, Harrison Ford just coasting along, not really giving it his all. You get the idea. The honest trailers and CinemaSins will probably tell you a whole bunch of other stuff that I'm not going to be able to cover in the time span of this video. I have always felt that this movie is not as bad as people make it out to be, but it's certainly, by Indiana Jones standards, the worst of all five. I posted a review right before I saw the fifth one, so I'm not going to rehash everything that I said in that video, but here's some of the highlights. With Indiana Jones taking on the Russians or the communists in the late 1950s, I think that was an appropriate choice of adversaries for him to fight against. Since in Raiders and Last Crusade, we had him fight the Nazis, given that it was the 1930s right before the Second World War. And as opposed to the 1930s and 40s adventure serial approach, this movie takes a feel of a 1950s sci-fi B movie. So it did make an attempt to do something different while trying to retain the core aspects of Indiana Jones. I'm not the kind of guy who is going to give a movie a pass just because it tried to do something original like a lot of people seem to do on YouTube. On paper, that's not exactly a bad idea, and it does kind of work in some ways, but for the most part, it doesn't really mesh. The movie looks really clean and freshly laundered as opposed to the other three films, which felt like they were actually shot in a backyard somewhere on location. And even the fifth one, that came 15 years after this, brings back some of that grittiness too. Harrison Ford, for the most part, gives it his all as the character, even though there are a couple of times where I think he's not really fully there with the script, particularly when he's holding the crystal skull while explaining it to Mutt. He's just carrying it like he just bought it at a department store. Ray Winstone's character Mac is terribly written and has no clear motivations other than money. Cate Blanchett as Irina Spalko is not that interesting of a villain, especially compared to some of the other ones that came before, like Donovan or Belloc. And Shia LaBeouf as Mutt Williams is, well, there's a reason why they didn't bring him back. Nuking the fridge, the monkey swinging, yeah, it's all ridiculous. Although the nuking the fridge moment is, well, yeah, really dumb. Remember, this isn't the first time that Indy has survived something this crazy. Does anybody remember him falling out of the plane onto a mountain on a raft in Temple of Doom? Besides the fact that that movie being good, why is it people are okay to excuse that, but not over here? But the movie is not completely terrible. There are some small moments that I do like. Indy pondering about how life is starting to catch up with him after losing Marcus, his father, but then finding out that he has a son and is reuniting with his first love, Marion, feeling like he might have a chance to actually have something that he wants since he's lived most of his life on his own. It doesn't really go anywhere with it, but I do kind of like the idea in theory. And while it might be John Williams' worst outing in the franchise with the musical score, it's certainly not a letdown. As far as I'm concerned, John Williams has never disappointed. You would have to argue really hard to convince me otherwise. And I've always liked the moment where Indy says, if you want to be a good archaeologist, you gotta get out of the library! Unfortunately, it's not quite enough to save the movie for me, and the alien skull is just really half-cooked of a concept, and the psychological warfare aspect that they try to go for with Spalko isn't necessarily a bad idea, but it feels very hollow, and the movie doesn't really go anywhere with it. If you're someone who thinks that this is way too out there for an Indiana Jones tale, check out the books. There's a lot weirder stuff that he encounters there. It's one thing in the books, I know, but don't act like the concept is a bad idea. It's all a matter of how you present it. Spielberg has said publicly that he is not happy with this movie, along with Temple of Doom, which we'll get to. I think if he were to do this again with the right mindset, the movie would be a whole lot better. Not a disaster, but in comparison to what came before, it is a huge, huge letdown. If you like the movie, that's totally fine. But for me, it left a lot to be desired. Next up at number 4, this one I think was really, really hard when I thought about where do I place these two. I think if I have to go with personal preference, I don't care if I'm going to get hate for this. Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. I know this might really set off some people since I put it just below Dial of Destiny, but let me explain, okay? I did a review a couple years ago. My opinion on it hasn't really changed. This movie is definitely a lot of fun. There's no denying that. And it's definitely, in a lot of ways, in the top tier category with Raiders and Last Crusade. But what really holds this movie back for me is the investment in trying to save the Shankara stones. Indy clearly wants to get this for the glory and fame of putting it in his museum. I mean, that's really why he does all this stuff in the first place. He doesn't really believe in the supernatural element of the whole thing, at least until the end of Raiders, which this is also technically a prequel to Raiders. I guess it kind of makes it clear in the movie, but not really. Anyway, got distracted. And I guess the stones are somewhat made up by the writers or creators, as opposed to the Ark and the Holy Grail, which both have basis in reality. They were trying to come up with something different and new, which, okay, that's all well and good, but I don't really feel that much of an excitement to find these stones and stop this evil cult that's operating under this palace. And as far as the violent content goes, this movie got a lot of backlash, with the heart being ripped out by Mola Ram, the idea of child slavery, people eating snakes, bugs, and monkey brains. Ugh.
It's disgusting.
And the film also got called racist for that scene in particular, and I think it would have helped if Indy or somebody in the room said something like, hey, these people don't eat this kind of food. Something's going on here. Apparently that's said in the novelization, so if they brought that into the film, I think that would have really helped. Violence in film in principle does not bother me. How you present it, like I've said multiple times, is what really makes a difference. Considering that this is a evil cult, I'm not really too bothered by some of the other things, but the heart being ripped out I think was going too far. I know some people really love that. They say how it's very audacious and risky, which to me does not make a movie good. Yeah, Spielberg did really try to go for it, but I think it might have been a little too much with that one moment, and I can't watch that scene without just feeling very repulsed. Maybe that was the intention that they were going for, but no, for me, it was too far. And because of the backlash, we now have the PG-13 rating in Hollywood. So in that way, Temple of Doom is very historical. But there's still a lot of fun to be had with Temple of Doom. His young sidekick, Short Round, I don't know the actor's name, nor can I pronounce it, but he was in the Everything Everywhere All at Once movie, which he won an Oscar award for. The Goonies and Temple of Doom did not do that guy wrong in the slightest. He might be a nuisance for some people, he's not for me. You call him Dr. Jones, doll. To the big fight that he has with the big baddie, which happens in every single Indiana Jones movie. The same actor, by the way, who plays the big bald guy in the runway scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark, Pat Roach, getting violently crushed by a conveyor belt, but not before he pounds Indy to a pulp nearly. Indy's also being tortured by voodoo, and Short Round is trying to stop that kid from doing it. John Williams' score also has a different flavor to it, which also plays into the horror-inspired imagery in Temple of Doom, and for a lot of people who are fans of the horror genre, this is the kind of movie for them. It's not my favorite genre, hence why I probably don't resonate with this movie as much, but that's neither here nor there. And we also get a fun minecart chase scene, which is very unique in the action genre, because usually it's helicopters, motorcycles, cars, and trains, and planes. Can you name any other action sequence in film that has a minecart? I can't. Not to mention moments of Dan Aykroyd making a small cameo appearance, Indy having a brief fight with some of Mola Ram's men, charging towards the camera and then running away, which might be a callback to Han Solo's moment in Star Wars A New Hope, and finally defeating Mola Ram while hanging from the bridge on the cliff. You betrayed Shiva. You betrayed Shiva. But one last negative, I suppose. Willie, played by Kate Capshaw, Steven Spielberg's now wife. I could do without her. She is, well, I don't want to say totally useless of a person, but she really is. A lot of times, she just flails her arms around and screams her head off at so many things. This, to me, is just too much. I don't need her in this movie, but you need a love interest, I suppose. What's an action-adventure film for? Temple of Doom is definitely my least favorite of the original three, but I would certainly prefer it over Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. There's no doubt about that. Even with all the violent content that's present, if I'm in the mood for it, I can pop it into my PS4 and have a good time with it. Now we're at number 3. A controversial placement. Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. I know. This is going to upset some of you, but I certainly prefer this over Temple of Doom, because as opposed to that film, there actually is an investment in the dial that Indy's trying to find. This is definitely nowhere near in the top tier category of the original 3 films. But any movie that comes out after those 3 films, they were bound to be littered with issues. Even the 4th film couldn't escape their shadows. If you were to go into it not expecting Last Crusade or Raiders or Temple of Doom if you're really that into it, but watching it for what it is, I think it would actually fare a lot better, because that's how it fared for me. You can check out my review if you want to know my full thoughts, but as far as the highlights, Indy's dragged back into the mix of adventure by his goddaughter, who wants to find the Dial of Destiny, stopping the Nazis, their leader played by Mads Mikkelsen, who wants to use it to go back in time to take over the place of Hitler to win the war. Considering that Indy's not getting any younger, he doesn't really see any other opportunity to take an adventure one last time. James Mangold's direction, I think, is very fitting for Indiana Jones. Considering that he's a classic film type of director, taking place in the late 1960s, he has a knack for portraying a past time period. If you doubt me, check out Walk the Line or 3:10 to Yuma. Nowhere near the level of Spielberg's direction in the original 3 films. That being said, James Mangold, I think, was the perfect fit to replace Spielberg. And I think it's clear in the film, he has a deep affinity and respect for the character. He doesn't try to make him do all these crazy stunts like we're used to seeing him in the original 3. He has his character struggling with his physical state. He does some of his own stuff, sure, like the action sequence in Tangier when he's trying to get the dial back and Mads Mikkelsen's chasing him, and the prologue that we get set towards the end of World War II where we see a young Indiana Jones fighting this Nazi officer to get the dial. That was classic Indiana Jones, and I think that if James Mangold were somehow to go back in time to the 1980s and make an Indiana Jones film, probably the closest that we'll get to see him making that kind of movie. Once you get over the obvious de-aged Harrison Ford and the older Harrison Ford voice that's used instead of a digitally altered one, the prologue is a ton of fun. And it brings back some of that vulnerability that was missing in Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. As for them going back in time to the ancient Roman Empire meeting Archimedes, as I said in my review, I didn't know if I liked it or not, but I liked that they went for it. Having seen it again and more time to process it, it's actually grown on me. It was definitely a huge leap, that's for sure, and I don't know if it entirely worked still in some way, but I still like the idea of him seeing someone that he's read about his entire life and wants to stay in a time period that he feels very comfortable in, since he feels like he's got nothing left to go back to, if Marion was never going to come back. And when she does, and they have their reunion, despite me thinking that it was a cop-out that they brought him back, them reuniting made me say, forget what I said. Dial of Destiny is a satisfactory conclusion to the franchise, and I also think in some ways a proper epilogue for the original trilogy. Probably why I don't think it really feels as big in scope. I don't know if that was James Mangold's intention, but if that was the case, I think it was very appropriate. Despite what plenty of other people online are saying about this movie and the lackluster box office returns giving the reputation of the studio with how they handled Star Wars, I don't think the YouTube reactionaries really help the situation either. But I think once enough time settles and we actually look back on this movie, maybe some will come around to it, which is becoming a popular trend now in the digital age. All of the negative craziness that comes out of it, and then the dust settles, and then people seem to look back on it really fondly. Couldn't we try to do that in the moment when we're experiencing it for the first time and not letting our emotions get in the way? Nevertheless, Dial of Destiny is certainly a worthy conclusion. Nowhere near as good as Raiders or Last Crusade, but it certainly gets the job done. Number 2, Raiders of the Lost Ark. I know some people that would consider Raiders their personal favorite of the franchise, and hey, I can certainly respect that. A simple yet thrilling action adventure with Indiana Jones trying to recover the Ark of the Covenant from the Nazis who want to use it for its power. From the opening iconic scene with Indy trying to take the idol and running away from the boulder, getting double-crossed by Alfred Molina's character, to him explaining to the government agents what the Ark of the Covenant is, finding Marion in Nepal, to the thrilling truck chase, which arguably is the best action sequence ever created. I've watched that clip on YouTube a million times over, among other action sequences in other movies, like the train scene in Spider-Man 2, Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 2. Best part of that sequence is when he crawls under the truck, climbing back onto it with the rope, and finally kicking that Nazi out of the driver's seat and running him over, revving up the truck, and the musical score flaring up triumphantly. Everything about this movie is lightning in a bottle. Similar to The Dark Knight, this movie never loses any steam. From the moment it starts, it fires on all cylinders. To call this the greatest action film ever made in cinema, that might be an understatement, but it might also be true. Not my personal favorite, but man, does it get really close, really close to my number 1, The Last Crusade. This was my introduction to Indiana Jones. This is my favorite action-adventure film of all time. I will die on that hill. This takes everything that we already liked about Indiana Jones, but further expanding on his character, showing us that he had a life, a strained relationship with his dad, played superbly by the great late Sean Connery. In a lot of ways, this movie definitely feels like Raiders of the Lost Ark Part 2. The Nazis are back trying to find a biblical item, this time the Holy Grail instead of the Ark of the Covenant. But the extra stuff that we get, with Indy's backstory being further fleshed out, we finally learn why he's afraid of snakes, where he got the hat, but him and his father managed to come to a common ground once again, when he thinks for a second that he might have lost him, and is relieved that he didn't die. And then his life hangs in the balance, and Indy has to go through those final challenges in order to save his father. The best finale in any of the Indiana Jones films. Oh no, I'm here now. What do you want to talk about? What? I can't think of anything. Then what are you complaining about? I suddenly remembered my Charlemagne. Let my armies be the rocks and the trees and the birds in the sky. There's so much more that I could talk about with this movie, but for time purposes, I'm not going to do that. Last Crusade has been and always will be my personal favorite of the franchise, as well as my all-time favorite action-adventure. Despite me liking Dial of Destiny, the final shot of them riding off into the sunset after their adventure, with John Williams' music playing... Oh, God! Oh, it's so... Oh, God. I don't like saying it, but...
Perfection.
Yeah, I said it. Well, Magneto said it. So that's my personal ranking of the Indiana Jones franchise. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope I didn't upset too many of you. If I did, I apologize. I am not in any way trying to do that. Like I said, my own personal opinion. If you have a different ranking than I do, that's totally fine. Just comment below and tell me what it is. Politely, please. Let's not get carried away here. Thanks again, guys. Stay tuned for more videos coming soon. And as always, till next time.